Shalom, welcome to another exciting week studying the Hebrew alphabet. This week we're going to look at the gems that's within the Hebrew letter Nun. Very exciting study. Let's get started. Thank you, Father, for this privilege to discuss your word and to just delve into the wisdom of the Hebrew language and from the context of the alphabet, specifically the letter Nun. Father, just reveal to us the depths and the wisdom and the life that is embedded within this letter, as well as within your word, so we can understand you more and that we can equip ourselves to become part of you and be resurrected into new life and into maturity. I just thank you for it in the mighty name of Yeshua Mashiach. Amen. We are at the 14th letter, which is the letter Nun. So following the letter Mem, Mem, just to quickly recap, is associated with water and the word of Yahweh. And Nun is an interesting letter. If you look at the pictograph, it looks like a little fish or something that swims. Specifically, if you look at the meaning of Nun, in Aramaic, Nun actually means fish, and it looks like a seed, and it can also refer to a sperm, which represents fruitfulness. So that's why the letter Nun means fruitfulness. Now, the letter Nun need to exist within the medium of the letter Mem. So that's what this picture is about. So the Nun exists within Mayim, or water, in this case, representing a fish. But also, on the other hand, it's the Nun that gives life to the water. So life doesn't have, or water doesn't have life in itself unless it sustains something living. And that's what the Nun represents. It's that physical life that exists within the water. So it gives the water meaning. And when you combine the two letters, Mem and Nun, because they are consecutive, the one is following the other, and you read it from right to left, it's a Mem Nun, that it makes the word man, that is translated as manna. So that gives us also the storyline of Israel traveling through the wilderness, and they needed supernatural food to sustain themselves in the wilderness. So without the manna, they could not exist. Now, if you translate that back to the meaning of the letter Mem, that is part of this word man or manna, it is the word of Yahweh that sustains life. But in the context of the Nun, it actually means that the word needs to be applied and lead to fruitfulness in your life, and only then it will give you that sustenance, which is manna. So without fruitfulness that comes from Yahweh's word, there is no spiritual life, which is the symbol of manna. So that's just an interesting thought with the two letters linked together. Now, in the context of the wilderness and manna, if we just look at the shape of the letter Nun, Nun looks like a small bet and also a small kaf. It's got the same physical outline. It's just a shortened form of both of them. And previously, when we looked at the letter kaf, it means collective hand, or it also represented the body of Messiah. Now, the letter bet represents the house, and the house in context of the wilderness is the tabernacle. So the Nun is connected, or give us the idea of the house of Yahweh in the wilderness and giving sustenance to the body of Messiah, or to the body that exists in that house. You know, in the Old Testament time, that body was called Israel. In the New Testament time, it's still Israel, but also known as the body of Messiah. And they got their sustenance within the desert, but this manna is now connected to the house, and it's given to the people within that house, and that's the bet and the kaf symbolism. So the Nun connects all of these ideas together. So traveling through this life, which is the wilderness, we need to be connected together, which is the body, and we need to assemble within the house, which is the bed or the tabernacle, which houses the presence of Yahweh. But not only that, if you look at the two expressions or the way Nun can be written, you have the first Nun, which is normally found within the beginning of a word or the middle of the word, and then you get the Nun at the end, which is Nun Sufit, which has got a long tail. It looks like an enlarged Vav. So that gives us the idea that the fruitfulness of the Nun produces a Vav that is larger than a normal Vav. Now we know that Vav means man, so the larger Vav represents an extended or mature form of man, a greater man. So that is what the fruitfulness produces, is that level of maturity. So when we just look at the Nun, it gives us the two stages of man, the immature state or the initial state, and then the final state, which is the mature state. And that's what the Nun represent, is those two phases that we will be exposed to. And in the context of what we looked at, the house is the place where that takes place. We need the Manna in order to make that happen. And we need to be connected to other people, which is the collective hand, the Kaf, which is the body of Messiah in our time frame. Now, when you place the word Nun, if you write the word Nun out, it is made up of a Nun, a Vav, Nun. The Vav makes the U sound. So it's just two Nuns with a Vav in the middle, which is the vowel point. And that places the Vav right in the middle, which make it the most important letter. So now we have from right to left, we see that the product of the first two produces the large Nun, which is the enlarged Vav. So we see the progression from the small Vav to a large Vav, or in this case, just the symbolism of the large Nun, which represent the Vav. And the Nun on the right side is basically the spiritual fruitfulness that transforms the middle Vav, which is man, into a mature form. So we need that fruitfulness that comes from Yahweh. So that's one way to look at it. There's also other symbolism. If you look at the previous study when we did the letter Vav, we also had the two Vavs, but in the middle we had the question mark. So who is in the middle? Now that can represent Yeshua with the two people that were executed with him. And he was on the cross in the middle, and on the cross on the right we have the small Nun, which is the person who did not accept him. And then the large Nun is the one who accepted him, that met him in paradise later that day after he died. So that's also a beautiful picture of the word Nun, depicting the Messiah's work when he was on the cross, and how when you accept him, you are transformed into a mature or a larger form of man, which is that when we looked at Adam, that's the complete Adam, the fulfilled Adam, or the restored Adam. So that is also what this represents. So it's just the process and the work of Messiah that we can see in here. So moving to the next slide, still on the menorah pattern, we look at the word Nun. Now Nun is first found where it's described as Joshua being the son of Nun. Now that's an interesting concept in itself, because Joshua, when you write it or read it in Hebrew, it's actually the word Yahushua, which is the most accurate pronunciation of Yeshua's name in a Hebrew form. And if you translate that directly, it means that Yeshua is the son of fruitfulness, because that's what the Nun represent. But when we look at the word Nun, it's got two meanings, a positive and a negative meaning. The negative meaning is to degenerate or to die, and the positive meaning is associated with plants and life and seed, and that is to resprout or to propagate and to expand and grow like shoots from a branch. So we see that there's a form of a black and a white, a negative, positive, or in our case, when we studied the letter Tet, we looked at the concept of duality, where there's two poles, two extremes of life and death, darkness and light. And between those two poles, there's a force or an energy or a spiritual entity that exists between those two. And that field that flows is the energy that sustains this world which we exist in. So the world of duality is the physical realm. Now we see that duality also in the two nuns. The small nun represent the negative one, and the large nun represent the positive one. And between those two, we see the degeneration, which is the small one, and the one that resprout, that one that can be reborn or regenerated into life, which is the large nun at the end. And that sustains that field or energy or life in which man, in this case the Vav, exists in. So man can only exist within this field of duality, if you like, which is created by this symbolism of the two nuns, which will represent life and death in this case. Now, when Yeshua died on the stake, he was degenerated, or he died, and he was the son of fruitfulness. And when he was reborn, or he resprouted, he became the branch, and from him were offshoots, which are his body, which is that cuff that we looked at. So we see all the symbolism of the meaning of the word nun, as well as the symbolism of the letters, that all confirm the same meaning, which is around man and the work of the Messiah and the world of duality in taking man from a fallen state back to an elevated state of life, or oneness with Yahweh. Now, the next picture I found on Facebook, one of my Facebook friends, I think he's in Melbourne, he just posted these three pictures, and I thought that was fascinating. And all of these symbols that's in nature, on the left you get plants, and you can see from the smallest seed, it looks like a small Vav. And then you see the large nun, or the large Vav, in the symbolic state. That gives us the plant that just sprouted from the seed. And we see the process of coming from an immature state to a mature state within plants. But on the right, that's basically how we look like with our brain, which is the head, and everything below that, which is the little tail, is what's sustaining us. So we exist within our mind, or that's where our spiritual connection is, within our thought and our presence and our consciousness. And that's what the nun also represents. Specifically, when you look at the pictograph, it's like the little head there with the tail, and everything, our arms, legs, and nervous system is what sustains us. It's like roots growing into this physical realm, sustaining this life essence, which is our brain, where everything exists, which make up human form. So from this, we see all the symbolism of the nun within plants as within humans. And that confirms the word nun, that means to resprout, and that's also seen within plants and humans. Now, the next slide is looking at words that start with the letter nun. But what was interesting is that there's a lot of words that is associated with water, or the letter mem. Now, the first four words are linked to a river or a flood or a running stream. And I've just added the verses where they're first found in there, just to give us context of those words, to tell us a little story. Now, the first one is Nahar, Nun Hey Resh. That means a flood or a strong river. Figuratively, it means prosperity. So it's a positive meaning. And that's the river that went out of Eden. And it's similar to the river that's referred to in the book of Revelation. That's a river that flows from the throne of Yahweh. So it's a life-giving source, or where everything starts, which is the Father, and it flows from him. The next one, Nehar, is basically the same letters, but just with different vowel points. And that's found in Ezra 4 verse 10, and it's translated as river in context of the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, which is found also in the book of Nehemiah. And this is where the nations were brought over, and some of them settled by the river, and they were used to rebuild the temple. So we see now the river, which is the life source, which can be connected to Eden or the throne of Yahweh. And the nations now have access to the river. And the consequence of that, or the result of that, is that his house is being built. But we know that the house of Yahweh consists of people. So the symbolism of the nations, they are actually making up this house as they assemble around this life-giving river. And they're all connected to the Letter Nun, or fruitfulness. The next one, Nahar, it's the same letters, just different vowel points, is translated as stream or running or flowing. Figuratively, it means to be cheerful, to assemble, to flow together. And it's also got the meaning beam of light and to shine. So here we get the connection between water and light. So the same way water flows from top down, from a high place to a lower place, we now see the light shining from a bright place into darkness. So the light is designed to go into the dark places to enlighten it, and the water is designed to flow from a high place to fill the hollow or low places. So that is found within this word Nahar. And the consequence of that is to be cheerful, to assemble. So that again is connected to the letter Kaf, which is a collective hand, which represents the body of Messiah. And where this word is found is in Psalm 34, verse 5, where they looked upon him and were lightened or enlightened. So that's also a positive connotation to this word that starts with the letter Nun. So now we see that the letter Nun connects the Garden of Eden or the throne of Yahweh. It connects the nations, it assembles them, and as a result of them, they represent or build the temple or the house of Yahweh, and they are enlightened by coming into his house. The fourth word is Nachal, which is Nun Chet Lamet. That means valley, flood, or river. And that's found in Genesis 26, verse 17, where Isaac pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar. Now, this is an interesting word. Gerar means to chew the cud, and only kosher animals or clean animals chew the cud. So that means that the nations who now assemble around the river, who look upon him, are enlightened, and as a result of them, they chew the cud, or that means that they meditate on his word, because that's what the symbolism of a clean animal is, that whatever you take in, which is the word, you bring back, and then you rethink it, or bring it back to your remembrance and meditate upon it till it is part of your life. So those are beautiful pictures and all positive, connected to the letter Nun as well as the letter Mem, because all the context of these words are within the context of water, a river, or a flood, or a stream. And it leads to positive outcomes, which is to be cheerful, to assemble, to be enlightened, and to shine. Now, the next two words are also connected to water, but this is within the context of duality. Now, the first one is Noah, and Noah means rest, but Noah's got the storyline described in Genesis 15, verse 8, where it is describing the flood, which is judgment, but there's also a context of salvation. So we get the two poles, the one negative, which is judgment and the flood, the one positive, which is salvation, which Noah and his family went into Yahweh's rest during the time of judgment. And it's in the context of water once again. The second word is Nazal, Nun Zayin Lamet, that means to gush out, to pour down, flood or running water. Figuratively, it means speech or speaking. Now, this word is found in Exodus 15, verse 8, that says, with a blast of his nostrils, he split the water, and floods stood upright. So I was looking for a picture that got the same imagery. So it looks like flowing water, but it's flowing upwards. And the water that's flowing upwards produces this wall. So we see a flood, but not flowing in a normal direction. It flows from the bottom up. And it's like it's standing up in honor and awe of Yahweh. And what's also interesting is that the word nostril, nachar, starts with the letter nun as well. So we see that nostrils is also linked to this. And yet again, it's in the context of water, judgment, and salvation. But in this case, it's judging Pharaoh and his army and Israel that's been saved during the time of deliverance, which started with a Passover. The next 4 words are very interesting. They are connected to the creation of Adam, or man. Now, the first one is nefesh, which is nun page samech, and that is described in the context of Genesis 1 verse 20, which is day 5, where he created all the animal souls, and they all originate from a nun, which is a sperm or a seed. And the verse 20, it says, let the waters bring forth abundantly all the moving creatures that have life, and the birds. So we see all creatures that have life, that's animals as well as people, are brought forth abundantly from the waters. Yet again, we see the context of the mem, or water, and that it's connected to all living creatures, which includes man, but it's in the context of day 5. We all know that animals and men are created on day 6, but the foundation of the soul is laid within day 5, which is very significant. And that's explained in the next 2 words. The first one is neshama, which is nun shin mem hey. Now neshama, we see the 2 letters shin and mem inside of there. And when we looked at the previous study, mayim, we also had the context of the column of fire and the column of cloud. So we see those 2 processes, which is the process of elevating, and that's also Jacob's ladder. That's the connection back to Yahweh, or the rejoining to oneness from the world of duality to the spiritual state of unity back with him. And the neshama is where Yahweh breathed in the nostrils of man that he just formed from the earth. Yet again, we see the word nostril, and we see breath, which is the word ruach, that produce the soul called neshama, which is a higher soul. Now, this soul moved on to a state of rest, which is day 7, and that is where you just exist. You experience to be, to exist. So there's no force, there's no strive, there's no nothing. It is finished and you have arrived. It's that state. And that is depicted by day 7. So the neshama is created on day 6. The basis of the soul, which linked to animals as well as humans, is laid on day 5, as we saw with Genesis 1:20. And the next word, nachash, is translated as serpent. Now that is what we see in the story of Adam and Eve taking the fruit. And the nachash was the serpent that tricked Eve, and she basically gave the fruit to Adam. So man was enchanted, which is the next word, nachash, which means divination and enchantment. And looking at the meaning of the word enchantment and divination, it means to seek knowledge of the future and to seek knowledge of spiritual higher things. So he enchanted them to say, you will be like God, which is a spiritual thing. And he also told them their future, you will not die, which is a future tense. So he enchanted them with the 2 things that intrigued them, and then he trapped them in eating that fruit. And that brought them down to a state of duality. So the nachash is the force that pull you down to duality, and the ruach that they receive, which is the breath of life, pulls you up to the world of unity, which is day 7, and the nachash pull you down to day 5, which is just the primordial or the animal soul, which is just the living creature within the world of duality. So we see that the enemy used a technique, and they both share the same word, that produces those opposing forces, which we know as Hasatan, or the opposer or the enemy. Now, what's interesting is that the neshama that's created by Ruach made man superior to other souls, which was described on day 5 in Genesis 1:20. And the Nachash, which is described in Genesis 3:1, is translated as the serpent that was more crafty than any other beast, which is a nefesh that Yahweh created. So we see that the Nachash is a higher nefesh state, just like the neshama is a higher nefesh state. But the Nachash is a negative, higher form, and the neshama is a higher positive form. So fallen man actually fell down to a Nachash state, and they used to be in a neshama state. So the serpent, or the opposing force, want to pull you down to his level, which is still a higher level than an animal, but it is in a negative connotation. And in that negative space, you live in a state of day 6, no longer day 7, which is rest just to be, where there's no strife or no troubles, no issues, because you now is in a state of unity. Day 6 is in a state of duality, where there's always opposition, opposing forces. And that's where the strive towards, I want to know the future. I'm going to seek a prophet. I want to know what the outcome will be, or I want to know spiritual things. So we all have that drive inside of us because of the force of Nachash that operate in this lower state of day 6, or that try to push us down or pull us down to a day 5 primordial animal soul, which is even a lower state than a human. So that's how the enemy wants to pull us down, and how the Ruach, or Yahweh Spirit, want to pull us up. And those two opposing forces are working against one another. And man is the object of that force, right in the middle. I just want to quickly go back to that menorah pattern. So we see that man is the object. On the one side, we have mature Nun. On the other side, we have immature Nun. Now that is what the Nachash is doing. It's wanting to pull us back to a small Nun, and the Ruach want to create in us an enlarged Nun. Now this enlarged Nun is on the left, so that means it's possible to exist in a higher form within a world of duality, because Yahweh make it possible through his Ruach. So we don't have to wait and die till we get this higher level living, or this higher state. We can achieve that in this physical through the symbolism of this word Nun, as we previously looked at. So this was fascinating when I just meditated on these concepts, specifically when I read that the Nachash was more crafty than the other beasts of the field. So that means he's a higher state, just like the neshama is a higher state. So when you add Nachash to neshama, it pulls it down to a nefesh. But when you take a nefesh, you add ruach, you get the neshama. And that's what we want to achieve in this life, is to get the ruach, which is Yahweh's Spirit, to pull us up to a neshama state, which is that enlarged nun, which represent the larger vav, or the mature man. Now, when we look at the concept of water and the fish, or the nun and the mem, we see the symbolism that's also found in the New Testament. Now, Yeshua chose his disciples, and they were fishers of men. And yet again, the fish, the symbol of the nun, as well as the mem, which is the symbol of the water, and the fish inside of water, which is the word man that translates as manna, which is the spiritual essence we need to exist. Now, in saying that, the manna was given in the desert. So if you take a fish out of water, put it in the desert, it cannot exist unless you give it something supernatural to survive. And that's what the manna is. He gave us the ability to exist in this life, even though it's not possible to live in a higher form in this life. We can do it through the manna that he gave us through his Spirit. And we're going to look a bit later on that when we look at the word tanin, which has a double nun and a yod in there, which is the life essence added. So that is just a beautiful picture. Now, the early church had the symbol of the fish, which is basically derived from the disciples being fishers of men, and also probably the fruitfulness of the Nun and the fruitfulness or the fruit of the Spirit which they received. Now, this is where it gets interesting. We saw the Nachash. Now, the Nachash is one of the symbolisms of the Nun. If you look at the Paleo-Hebrew, it's that little seed-like or sperm-like. It can also represent a serpent or a snake. And where we found that symbolism is in Exodus chapter 4, when Moses cast his staff down and it became a serpent. Now, in this verse, where this is described, it used the word Nachash for that serpent. But later on, Aaron cast his staff before Pharaoh and his musicians, and then his staff became a serpent. But when you look at the Hebrew, it's the word Tanin, which is Taf, Nun, Yod, Nun. So we see the two Nuns there with the Yod in the middle, and it starts with the letter Taf. And this is a greater serpent than Pharaoh's serpent. So we can see the small Nun, the large Nun, which is a small serpent, the large serpent. The large serpent is the mature one, which consumed the small serpents of Pharaoh. So the symbolism of the two Nuns is illustrated in the battle of the serpents in the storyline. But now we see that the small serpent is called the Nachash. So the small Nun is a Nachash, which is that fallen higher state than a Nefesh. But the Tanin symbolize the large Nun, which is the higher state or the mature state or the anointed state, which is the followers of Yahweh, which is called Tanin, which is also a serpent. But in this case, the one serpent consumes the other. So in order to overcome the serpent had to be opposed by the same type, which is also a serpent. And that is all linked to the letter Nun. So the serpent in this case, the Tanin, is not an evil serpent. It is the serpent that opposes the enemy serpent and that actually overcame him. So that was a fascinating find to see the two words for serpent, and the one has two nuns and the Chash has only one nun, which is the small one. Now, why the two different words describing serpent? Now, we need to dissect the word Tanin to understand what it really means. So when we looked at Nefesh, we found that in day 5 in Genesis 1:20, where he said he created all living creatures, even man. So that's a foundation of the soul, or the fallen, or the immature state, which is that small nun. But when you read the next verse, still on day 5, it says that Yahweh created the great Tanin. And that is translated as whales. But no one knows what Tanin actually means. It can be a whale, it can be a big fish, it can be a dragon-like thing that lives in water. Nobody knows what a Tanin is. So you have to dissect the letters to actually find out what it is. But we got a hint from what's in Exodus with the serpent, which is connected to the larger Nun, that it means it's something positive that's created for the world of duality to overcome the opposing force and fighting on the same level, so to speak. So Yahweh created a serpent that will overcome the negative serpent. And that symbolism later on we also see in the symbolism of the brazen serpent on the pole that overcame the serpents that bit and killed Israel and the people. And they had to look upon the serpent on the pole, which is actually the Tanin, in order to overcome the Nachash. The same symbolism there, and the two nuns, or the two paleo Hebrew nun symbolism, also found in that storyline. Now, Tanin starts with the letter Taf, which is the last letter, and the letter Taf means death. It also means it is done and it is finished, which are two positive meanings in relation to the negative one, which means death. So Tanin has to do with dying, but also with completion, and that something is complete or finished. So it's got a positive outcome, at least that it is now finished, even though it's a bad thing or whatever. We came to a point of completion, which is always a good thing. So Tanin contains two nuns, as I said, the small and the large, which represent these forces of duality, or the two serpents, the opposing forces that exist within the world of duality. But in between these two nuns, we have the letter Yod, which we know is the hand of Yahweh, which is also the spark of life, or the energy that comes from Yahweh, which has and contain all life. So we see that the life force is working in between the two nuns, transferring or translating the small one into the larger one, or the immature one into a mature one, which is the symbol of the Vav, which represents man. So it leads to maturity. So the end result of this word Tanin, which is represented by the letter Tav, it is finished, is that large nun. So the Tanin is the process that needs to take place that will take you from an immature state to a mature state, from a fallen state to an elevated state, or from a state of duality to a state of unity, which is where we want to be, which is the Adam state, prior to sin. So that is all found within this word Tanin. So now we get a bit more of an understanding of what the serpent Tanin represents. So it's not a negative thing, it's a process that overcome the serpent within, which is that Nachash, which is a higher level than the Nefesh, but it's a negative elevated state that may give you the idea that you are okay, but you may be spiritual, seeking spiritual things, seeking things about the future, but it's not really the right way, which is seeking Yahweh. So we should never look at the hand of Yahweh, the things of Yahweh. We should always look at Him to find Him, because He is our reward, not His things within His kingdom. So that's just a bit more understanding there. So going to the next one, we get the big fish, or the great fish, the Tanin. But it now is connected to Moses. Now we know that Tanin represents a serpent, but in this case, Tanin can be that whale or that big fish. So in Exodus chapter 2, it describes the birth of Moses, and he was from the tribe of Levi. He was even eaten for 3 months, and he was placed in an ark. And then he was taken from the water, and that was what gave him his name, drawn from the water, which is the word Moshe. And if you read Moshe the other way around, it is the word Hashem, that means the name, or that also means, or Yotevave. So Moses actually means the reversal process to get back to Hashem, or to get back to Yahweh. And the process is to go into an ark, or into a hidden state for 3 months prior to that being hidden. And that connects to the 3 days that Yeshua was in the grave. And then he was raised from the water, or brought forth from the water, which give us his name. And that is basically what the birth or the rebirth process represent, which we also know as the mikvah. But looking at that in the context of Moses, we know that Moses was born. Then there was a 3-month process. Then he was placed in the water, and then taken from the water again, as if he was born a second time. So now we get the idea that Tanin represents rebirth, or the concept of what it means to be reborn. So when you think to yourself, when Yeshua spoke to Nicodemus and said, you need to be born again, that is linked to Moses. The story of Moses, the symbolism of Moses, that was born, placed in the water, and born again, drawn from the water, as if he was born again. And now we see the 2 nuns in Tanin coming into full understanding of what that represents. So the first nun is your physical birth. The large nun is your rebirth, or the second birth, or spiritual birth. Now, what's interesting is that Moses was from the tribe of Levi, and he was called another name. He was called Levi Tanin, and that is pronounced Leviathan. And the sages call Moses the great fish because Tanin is connected to him in his name. So now we see that a Levi connected to Tanin gives Leviathan, and Moses, who was a Levi, is also connected to Tanin, and he is called the great fish, or the one that was reborn. So Leviathan is also the symbolism describing the rebirth process. So Leviathan can have a negative connotation, just like a serpent has a negative connotation, where the Nachash is negative, Tanin is positive. Now we have Leviathan, which is a creature that lives in the ocean, which can depict the enemy and the evil forces within the sea, where death and chaos reigns. But in this context, Leviathan is the process of bringing someone into a reborn state, but also connect them to the concept of Levi, which is a priest. So now your rebirth actually connects you to a state of becoming a priest. Now we read in the New Testament that we are from the priesthood of Melchizedek, so we are a royal priesthood. So that's where the Levi or priest is connected to the rebirth process that actually make you into a priest. Now, when you look at the meaning of a priest, where's my meaning of a priest? I've got that somewhere. So the priest or Levi, the word Levi means to interweave. Now, when you want to weave a tapestry or a carpet, you have horizontal strands and vertical strands. Those horizontal strands connect you to other people. That's what the Levite had to do, is to link people together and to connect them to the vertical strands, which is connecting them to Yahweh. And when you interweave those two processes, you get this beautiful tapestry or picture that represent the fellowship of people facilitated by the priesthood. So we not only become reborn, we become priesthood that facilitate the process of bringing people together, which is the collective kaf, into the house, connecting them horizontally to Yahweh, which is that elevated nun, that large nun, into maturity. And every single one of us that is reborn by the work of the hand of the Spirit, which is that Yod, give us the authority or the anointing to be a priest. So Yahweh not only saved people after Messiah, he elevates us to a state of priesthood, and so that we can be useful in his kingdom. So that's just something that links to Levi, and why Leviathan, which is the process of rebirth and bringing to a state of priesthood, is a positive connotation or meaning to that is linked to Moses. And in Moses' name, as I said, Moses backwards is Hashem. So Moses and Leviathan is the process that reverts you back to Hashem, to Yahweh. So that's just a beautiful picture and some interesting facts around Moses' name and his connection to this big fish called Leviathan. Now Jonah, same as Moses, we see the number 3. Same as Yeshua, where we see the number 3. He was 3 days in the belly of a big fish. Now this big fish, as we saw with Moses, is basically the symbolism of Leviathan, which is that process that had to take place. So Jonah going into the big fish means that that's the way of getting reborn and the way of being anointed as a priest. So we also see that within the name Yonah, which is Yod Vav Nun Hey. Now in my notes I sent out if this was a bit of a mistake, so I fix it in the current notes here on the presentation. So we see that the Vav Nun, we know the Vav is man, the Nun is the fallen state, sit within the Yod and the Hey, and we now see that this big fish, which is the Leviathan, is actually Yahweh in disguise, because it's Yod Hey, which is Yah, that's short form from Yahweh, and Yonah was actually the Vav Nun that go into Yah for 3 days, and when the big fish spit him out, he was a mature nun, or a priest. where he could do the work of a priest. Prior to that, he did not want to do the work of the priest, and then being transformed in the belly of this big fish that we saw represented by Leviathan produces a Levite or a priest, an anointed, mature state that can do the work with the anointing of that yod in their life, being transformed over that 3-day period. Now, then we know that the 3-day period, in connection to Yeshua, depict his death. Now, as I said, Taf represents death as well. So Leviathan, or this big fish process, means that you have to die, and that's what the meaning of Yonah being in the belly is. It signified his physical, or his death. And then the resurrection is when he is spit out. That's also the symbolism of the mikvah, going into the water, coming out of the water. But in this case, it's confined within this fish. That's all in the context of water. And coming out of the water is that rebirth process that Yonah also experienced, the same as Moses, the same as Yeshua when he was rose from the dead. And the same when you go into the water with the mikvah, when you come out, you are not only reborn, you're also priesthood. And just like Yonah, you can go and speak to the people of Nineveh, warn them, and then they will be saved. And then the nations will go to the river and assemble and be part of the process of building the house of Yahweh, being enlightened, just like we saw with those words, starting with the Letter Nun. So all of these stories and symbolism are all connected to the Letter Nun, and most of these words are either connected to water or to the soul, or the changing of the soul of man from an immature to a mature state. And we're just now looking at the process called tanin and the process called Leviathan, which is transforming you, which is basically another word for becoming reborn. And that's also what the New Testament is all about. So everything in the New Testament is found in the Old Testament symbolism, as we discuss here tonight around the Letter Nun. So it's a very interesting study, and I was actually fascinated by all these concepts. Now, in looking at the picture of Yonah's name, the fish is depicted by Yod Hey, which is Yah, and Yonah, or the man, is the Vav and the small Nun. And we are, Yonah was in Yah, or in Yahweh. And in the New Testament, we read we need to be in Christ or in Messiah. And this is what that symbolism or that phrase means. If I say I am in Christ or in Messiah, it means that I'm in the process of being transformed into a royal priesthood, because he is the high priest. And that process transforms me to be useful in his kingdom, so I can bring the nations in, enlighten them, so they can help to build the temple and be the building blocks of the house of Yahweh. So the power of the Nun is working within being in him, and the concept of being born again. Beautiful symmetry and picture language. Now, I chose this picture because it looked like someone who just walked out of the mouth of the fish, and they now see the light. So that's Jonah coming out of the fish, and he's now being enlightened, reborn. He's now a full-fledged priest, and he can now do the work of Messiah, or the work of what Yahweh wants him to do. So Leviathan, as I said earlier, depicts the priesthood. Our new priesthood is no longer Levi, it's Melchizedek. And Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. Now, there's only one righteous king, and that's Yeshua the Messiah, and he is the high priest by carrying that name, and we are subject under him. When we look at the big fish, tanin, it means that you need to die, and then your immature soul will be resurrected by the power of the Spirit. And that's exactly what the New Testament says. That's exactly what Paul said, that Yeshua was raised from the dead with the resurrection power of the Spirit. And that's what we see in this word tanin as well, and the symbolism of the big fish and the Leviathan. Now, what's interesting about a Leviathan, it's also found in the book of Job. Now, Job chapter 41 described the awesomeness of Leviathan. prior to that, you read about Job's life, and he was prosperous, and then something happened. He was tested. And Yahweh said, you should just not kill him, but you can test him in any way. And then he lost everything, and he went through a very terrible time. And at the end of this book of Job, in chapter 41, it described Job describing the awesomeness of Leviathan. And he also stated there that Leviathan was given by Yahweh. So it came from Yahweh. It's not an evil force whatsoever in this context. And when he acknowledged the awesomeness of Leviathan, that's when his ordeal ended and where he received everything back. It is as if the whole book of Job described the story of Jonah within that 3-day period, all the hell he went through during that 3 days. It also described the death and the suffering of Messiah prior to his death and also within the grave. And that's the whole storyline of Job in another symbolic format. And when he acknowledges the power of Leviathan and Yahweh's power beyond that, that's even greater, that broke that ordeal. And that made Job become born again, and he was set free from that testing and trialing period, which we saw earlier is what the wilderness is about. And we need the manna, we need the word, we need to be fruitful in the word, we need the tabernacle, we need the house, we need the body, and we need to exist in that with the Spirit in order to sustain us during this trial period which Job is describing through his life story. So facing Leviathan is the process of suffering, and that suffering will cause your little nun, your fleshly soul, which is your nefesh, to die, and then you will be resurrected into a neshama, which is the large nun, and also the large vav, which is a mature form, which is the priesthood or the elevated Adam. So that is a beautiful picture, also describing the death and resurrection process to be reborn in the storyline of Job. Looking at Nun, it's got the number 50. Now, there's just a few interesting things about the number 50 that's found in scripture as well as in normal life. First of all, the number 50 and the number 5 both share the meaning that means grace. So everything we go through, even that terrible trial period you go through, is grace to you, because the end result of suffering is always elevation and maturity. Paul said you need to rejoice when you are tempted. Rejoice when you go through suffering, because through patience, you will receive a reward. And in this case, it is that elevated state or that mature state. So that's what this grace is the context of. You always need grace during a time of suffering. I don't need grace when things go well. I need grace when I suffer. So grace is always in the context of suffering. And that's where Nun is basically linked to that. And specifically the small Nun or the immature Nun that is trialed and tested. He needs a lot of grace to have patience to become a big Nun or mature Nun. The word Exodus is used 50 times in the Torah. So that means there's a lot of things that need to exit your life. You need to get rid of a lot of things, unlearn a lot of things. That's basically just describing your death of your nefesh. You need to let go of yourself. You need to be selfless. You need to be humble. You need to get rid of your pride. So it's all about the Exodus out of Egypt, or Egypt exiting you. The next one is that 50 is also connected to the Jubilee here, where you receive liberation from debt. So that's also being liberated from the small Nun, liberated from all the things you need to exit and the things that need to exit you, which is basically death to the nefesh and death to the old man, as Paul described that. Something interesting, they say that you are regarded as one with wisdom after the age of 50. So next week, Friday, no, in 2 weeks, I'll be 50. So only then I am a wise man. So until then, I'm still a bit foolish. So I can't wait for that day on the 9th of November so I can become wise. Now that sounds just something interesting and funny. Also, something interesting, around about the age of 50, when you start a family, around about 20 or in your 20s, that's where your children will start to exit or exodus your house, and you will be liberated from them. So that's just Jubilee and Exodus, a bit of play of words there in relation to your age, which is normally true to all of us. Not that leaving your children leaving you is a good experience necessarily. Number 50 is also connected to Shavuot, or where the covenant was given. And there's a count of 50 days between first fruits and Shavuot. And first fruits is linked to fruitfulness, which is the Nun. And we know that the Nun will lead to the covenant. So the small Nun start off without covenant. The large Nun is within covenant through that 50 process, that period of grace suffering that you need to go through in order to become that mature Nun where you can embrace the covenant. That 50 is also linked to the fulfillment of Shavuot, which is the outpouring of the Spirit, which is the born again process, which we just looked at, which is the Tanin process and the Leviathan that you need to face in order to become a priest and mature Adam. What's also interesting is the word Ephraim. That means double fruitfulness or double Nun, which is 250s, which basically is Shavuot and the fulfillment of Shavuot. So you're in covenant and you have the anointing. In covenant means that you have the ability to access his Torah and his wisdom. And the second one, fulfillment, is the anointing as the priesthood. So you can have the fruit of the Spirit as a priest, where you can mean something to other people and the nations. Looking at the Gematria from other words within Scripture, there's a couple of words there. And the first ones we're going to look at are all related to positive words. Now, the first one is Adama, that means the earth. Then Atma, that means red, earth, or ground, land. And those are in relation to the creation of man, or Adam, as we saw with the Ruach being blown into his nostrils, he became an Neshama. He was created as a Nefesh. And the foundation is the earth, or the red earth, or the ground, which form the foundation of all life prior to Yahweh creating all living creatures, as described on day 5. The next one is Yelut, that means to be born, confirming our discussion around being reborn, the second birth or the large Nun. We get the word Yom, which is sea. That's also linked to water, which is the context of Mem, as well as the nations. Kol, that means whole or to be whole, to become in the fullness, and that's the large Nun or the maturity. We get the word Medev, that's garment, that's a covering. Adam and Chava or Eve was covered after they sinned, and that's where the grace or the number 5 or 50 come in, and that's that covering that keep you alive, which is also linked to the Manna, until your elevation, the final elevation when Messiah arrived and come on his second coming. And then there's Maha, that means to linger, to tarry, to wait, and to delay. That's to do with your patience, and also with the second coming of Messiah, where he awaits as long as he can for as many as possible people to come in, to become born again, and to become that mature Adam. So beautiful symbolism around the number 50. Negative connotations to 50 is that other Nun, or the duality, the concept of the duality, the two poles. This is the negative pole. Jezebel, we all know that that is a connotation to a religious spirit, which is normally described as a female, which linked to a church or to a religious system. So Jezebel is the opposing spirit that creates a religion that's opposing to Yahweh's body or his house. So that's where religious institutions come in that simulate spirituality, which is the Nachash. They seek spiritual higher things. They want to know the future. That's basically Jezebel operating. And the Nachash, or the serpent, sit behind that system, which is basically driven by Jezebel. Jezebel is also linked to prophets because she was killing prophets, killing them not to wipe them up, killing them to replace them. So she's the one who wanted to fulfill the function as a priest, hence the Nachash, or the divination, wanting to know the future. And then we have devouring and locusts, which is basically the same Hebrew letters, which is Kazam, and that is where the pastures for the sheep of Yahweh are now being devoured. So the pastures for the sheep is the word. So anything opposing to the word, which is truth, is a lie. So lies and trickery, and that's what the Nachash used to trick Eve. It's like a locust that came in, devoured the truth, spread lies, and then he tricked her with his Nachash, and she and they both fell into this slightly higher level, but under the control of the Nachash. And the last two is Atam, that means to shut up and to close, and Hama, to growl, to roar, to growl, cry aloud. And that is linked to I've got the picture of the 5 wise virgins, the 5 foolish ones. So Jezebel has the virgins, or the religious people, on the outside. They don't have oil. And the 5 wise virgins are the ones who went through the process of Tanin. They faced their Leviathan. They went through suffering. They cling on to the grace and patience of Yahweh, and they are fulfilling the work of Yahweh because they have engaged this covenant. The others have a form of holiness that's based on religious practices or man-made traditions, which look religious or holy, but it is not. It's a counterfeit, and they will be shut outside while the others enter the wedding feast with the Messiah. And that's just a picture of the other side of grace. So we have 5 foolish virgins, 5 wise, linked to the number 5 and 50 within the Nun. The next one is interesting. That's a passage in Numbers 10, verse 35 to 36, where there's 2 inverted nuns within the Torah that basically bracket in the passage that's the following, that says, whenever the ark set out, Moses said, rise up, Yahweh, may your enemies be shattered, may your foes flee before you. And then verse 36 says, whenever it came to rest, he said, return, Yahweh, to the countless thousands of Israel. Now this was basically recited every time the ark was taken out and the ark was placed back into the holy place. And the ark depicted the presence of Yahweh. That's why he said, return, Yahweh, and rise up, Yahweh. You refer to the ark as Yahweh as if it is Yahweh because it contained his presence. So it's bracketed in between the 2 nuns. Now, if you look at the ark in the picture, you get the 2 cherubs on top of the ark, covering and protecting whatever is inside that is holy. So the 2 nuns are actually the guardians of what's in the inside. Now we all know that what's in the inside are the 2 tablets, the rod of Aaron and manna. We saw that the manna is supernatural food that's linked to the nun, the mem. We also know the rod of Aaron was cast down and became the tanin. We know the 2 tablets are Shavuot, the covenant, linked to number 50. They're all linked to the number Nun. And the number Nun is the fruitfulness, which linked to the enlightenment, as we saw with the other word, of the people who trust upon him. Let me just quickly go back to that slide. They were enlightened. Where are you? They were lightened. When we looked at the 4 words that's linked to Mayim, linked to the Mem, and water, when they looked upon him, they were lightened. And they had to chew the cud. We had the rebuilding of the temple, and we had the river that went from Eden, and the revelation of the river that comes from the throne of Yahweh, or the presence. So we see the same symbolism linked back to all these words. I think I missed now. Where am I? and to the presence of Yahweh, all connected to the Nun. What's also interesting is that the double Nun, as we saw in the Torah study, is the two fish of Pisces. And Pisces is the 1,000-year period called the Age of the Gentiles. And the Age of the Gentiles is basically where Ephraim, which is a picture of Christians or followers of Messiah, that go out into the world and bring the nations in. They are the ones with the double Nun, or the double fruit. That's what Ephraim means. They have the two Nuns. They've got the small one as well as the large one. They are reborn, and they are priesthood that operate during the time of the Gentiles, or the Age of the Gentiles, to bring people into the presence so that they can engage with the rod of Aaron, which is a Tanin and Leviathan, to be reborn again. They engage with the Mem and the Nun, which is the Manna, which is supernatural food that leads to fruitfulness as a result of the word. And they also engage with the tablets, which is the covenant, which is connected to 50, which is grace, as well as 50, which is Jubilee, which is as well as the fulfillment of Shavuot, which is the outpouring of the Spirit, or that yod that work within the two Nuns that elevate you to a large Vav, or to a mature state. So that is the work of Ephraim. So the body of Messiah, the large calf that looks like Nun, is basically what Ephraim represents. And they have the presence of Yahweh, because it said, rise up Yahweh, return Yahweh. And that is what Ephraim has access to during the time of the Gentiles, or that time of grace, the time of number 50. The next one, which is the second last slide, has to do with the next two consecutive letters, which is the Nun Samech. Nun Samech make up the word Nas, that means sign, banner, or signal. Now, in the context of the Nun, we see that everything we discussed is something you can see. It's a sign. The baptism and the mikvah is a sign for being born again. There's something physical you can see. The 12 tribes had banners in the wilderness that had symbolism on them that people could see. We had Jonah, which is the sign of Messiah's death and resurrection. We have the sign of the double Nuns within Ephraim, and the sign of Pisces, which is the sign of the Age of the Gentiles. We had the sign of Moses' staff, the sign of Aaron's staff, and we had the sign of the bronze serpent on the pole, which is the Tanin that overcame the other serpents, the Nachash, who bit the people, and the Tanin overcome the Nachash. And it also represents, Tanin represents the Messiah, the big fish, and if you are in him, just like Noah, you will be spit out or born again, and you will be a full-fledged priest that can interweave people together inside the big calf, inside his house, and connect them horizontally back to Yahweh, elevate them to the level of oneness, which is the mature state, the large Vav of maturity. The last slide is just a summary of what we discussed. So we had the Nun, which is fruitfulness, it's life, that sustain life. We had the pictograph of Nun, which is a sperm, a seed, a serpent. It's also linked to plants, which is a seed, and it's all connected to life. Nun is in relation to Mem, sustaining life that leads to fruitfulness, also linked to Shavuot, which is the fruit of the Spirit, or the result of the Spirit that's in your life working. The Nun that look like other letters, the Bet and the Kaf, that's a house and the body that we need to be sustained during this life wilderness, where we will receive supernatural food as interchanged through the help of the fruit of the Spirit given by fellow believers to one another. The two Nuns represent the immature, the mature state, humility and righteousness, death, resurrection, and life, fallen state, and elevated state. The Nun is associated with the Nachash, the serpent, which is the negative. It's also associated with the Tanin, which is the positive side of the serpent that devoured the serpent of Pharaoh. It's connected to Levi that elevate you to a priest state, which is basically what Ephraim is. Nun, and the number 50 is linked to the creation of Adam, which is the first level, is day 5, the Nefesh, then the Neshama, and the overcoming of the Nachash state to back to Neshama through applying Ruach, which is that little yod in Tanin. And then Nun represents the fruitfulness of Yahweh's people, which is the fruitfulness of his word, as well as the fruitfulness of your actions. And the people who are fruitful are guardians of the presence of Yahweh, or the holy things of Yahweh, which is in the ark, which is his covenant, his Tanin process, which is baptism, as well as his supernatural fruit, which is his word, which are the basic 3 ingredients that we need to be Ephraim. And that basically concludes our study on the Letter Nun. So I'm going to unmute you guys. So if you want to ask questions or make comments, you are all welcome. Hi, Marnie.
Hi. Hi, it's lovely to see you.
Yeah.
Tammy's not well tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she's in bed.
Oh, no.
So I thought I'd try to come on myself, and I got through. I've been on once before, but I couldn't speak to you.
Oh, okay.
No, that was very interesting, but there's a lot there for us to learn.
There is. It's still a lot of little chunks that we need to meditate upon. I guess there's much more there, but it gives us a good indication of specifically the mikvah, understanding that, seeing that in Jonah, seeing that in Moses' name. So the New Testament concepts of resurrection, to be born again, is not something that Paul invented. It's something in the symbolism within the Old Testament as revealed through the Letter Nun. And that was fascinating to me when I saw that.
Well, it surprised me with Moses, with Levi and the Leviathan.
Yeah.
That really, yes, Tammy and I had a little chat about that this afternoon. And yes, we were both very surprised at the, because were the Levites set in place then?
Say again?
Were the Levites set as well, they were the priesthood. Were they set in place then?
It was Moses. Moses was the first Leviathan. He was Levi Tanin. He was called that Tanin. And he was
the first Levi virgin.
He was the first Leviathan, or the symbol of that. And Messiah is the other Leviathan, which is symbolized by the big fish that swallowed Jonah.
Yes.
And that's the Yah that sit outside, and the Vav Nun, which make up the word Jonah, and we are in him. And if we are in him, we're in the process of becoming born again and becoming priesthood.
That's right. And that's another concept. Like I never thought about people being born again, Old Testament or Torah or any of that, and because it's not really spoken of that clearly, and in the New Testament, of course, if you belong to a Pentecostal church any time in your life, they talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
So it was really good to see that it was, the Bible explains itself anyway.
Yeah, so now we can see Moses was born again, Jonah was born again, Job was born again, because the principle is true. It's a process. It's not something that happened after Messiah came the first time. It's a process that happened in the past that is still true. And we share the symbolism, which is the Samech or the Nun Samech, which is the sign. And you have the same symbolism and sign in your life, you are born again. If you don't have the symbolism and signs in your life, you're not. In the same way, Moses had the symbolism and the sign. Jonah had it. And
Yes, it was very good. And I thank you for keeping up these lessons for us. I try to keep them up. I've been handwriting them, but now Sue is printing them for me, which is very lovely.
Yeah.
So, but I still handwrite them when I get home so that I learn a little bit
Always good.
more.
Always.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so thank you so much for that.
No worries, a pleasure. Anybody there in Adelaide?
Yes. Hello,
Yes,
me
David.
again.
David.
That was very interesting. Thank you, Philip. Just some things that I noticed. Psalm 34:5 talking about looking unto him, bringing enlightenment. There's a lot of talk there's been a lot of talk for many years about spiritual enlightenment, and we've always known that the New Age path of enlightenment is a false path,
which is the harsh enlightenment. Yep.
Yes.
The
So Psalm
Kundalini enlightenment. Yep.
So Psalm 34:5 just points out very clearly that true enlightenment is looking unto him.
Yeah. The bronze one, the TaNaK process, is the rebirth process. It's a real enlightenment, as personified in Messiah. Yep.
Yes. And also you mentioned that in Aramaic, nun means fish, and also the letter nun comes after the letter mem, which means water.
Yep.
And in Genesis 1:20, it reads, "Let the waters," that is the mem, "bring forth or bring out the fish, the nun." So the fish coming out of the fish nun coming out of the mem water.
And that's the alphabet. Yeah.
That fits alphabetically.
Perfect.
As well.
Yeah.
And also, did you know that the word tax levy, as in Levy, comes from that Hebrew word Levi?
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah.
And going back to Job, when God is speaking to Job and asks him to consider Leviathan, which you brought up, the term Leviathan also has a connotation of formidable.
Yeah.
You know, something big, large, and formidable. So that ties in with Moses being Leviathan and Messiah being Leviathan as well.
Yeah. That's right. Same symbolism.
Yep. And another thing I thought of was the age of Pisces, that is the fish, coinciding with the age of Gentiles.
Yep.
It just reminded me of evolution professors teaching that man has evolved out of the fish. So that's the other corruption there through Jezebel, that they've taken it to such a stupid degree that even the concept of the age of Pisces coinciding with the age of Gentiles comes into play there.
Yeah. And what's interesting about the age of the Gentiles, if we look at that 4 words, where we have the nations brought over to assist in the rebuilding of the temple. They settled by the river, and that's the nations, which is the age of the Gentiles, and they will be part of the house of Yahweh because we are living stones, and they get their life source from the river, which is the mem, the word. And when they look upon him, they will be enlightened, which is that part of the rebirth process that takes place. And then they will chew the cud. They will then do holy things and clean things and try to please Yahweh. Yeah.
Philip, I was just thinking about the pattern of the big nun consuming the smaller one. Is Marnie sneezing? It sort of is a pattern for Yeshua when he died on the cross. He consumed. It was only a man who could die for our sins.
Yeah.
There's a similar pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be a great nun in order to carry all the small nuns' shortcomings. So it takes a big man or a big fish to swallow all of that. That's why Messiah is greater. Messiah is like Leviathan. The awesomeness of him is so great. We can't compare him to a human. He's just as far removed from Job that he could say he's so awesome, and then Yahweh is even greater than him. So that just elevates Messiah to a high level beyond our understanding itself.
Philip, another consideration, the imagery or the symbols and signs and the banners for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. That will be interesting to do a study on that.
Yeah.
We noticed that Dan has the serpent.
That's it.
And
he's got the Nun as well.
Aborigines have that.
Yeah, and he's got the large Nun. He's got the large Nun, Dalet Nun, the large Nun, which is the enlarged one, which is the good one, the Tanin. But that serpent is not a bad serpent. It's the process of becoming born again that's linked to judgment, which we saw in the two words in this slide, which are the two processes of Noah and Nazal, which is the two judgments, which is connected to salvation as well. And that's Dan. So you will be saved with the large Nun in the time of judgment, which is Dan. And then enter through the door, which is the Dalet, if you have the large Nun, or completed the process of Tanin in your life, facing Leviathan, being born again. Any other questions or comments? No worries. Yes, so we've got friends over this weekend coming from Canada. So I will probably not be able to do a study this week. And our other friends in Brisbane or Gympie invited us to do a Hanukkah study somewhere in November, is it? So I will, it will probably be, I don't know what day it will be, maybe a Friday evening.
No, it's going to be Saturday.
Oh, it's going to be a Saturday, but I can make that, record that, or we can do a live thing then as well. But I will be in contact through email just to let you know. And and then I will also send some timing through when we're going to do the Samech in the meanwhile, so it won't be this coming Friday. Alrighty. Thank you very much. Have a blessed Sabbath, and be blessed and enjoy your Tanin and face Leviathan process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Philip, thank you. Can you just close for us in prayer?
Yep, Paul. Thank you, Father, for your awesomeness and your greatness. And just by studying one letter, we get so much of the truths that's in the Old Testament revealed in the New Testament and reconfirmed by the Letter Nun. I'm amazed to see how much truth and wisdom is interweaved together that just confirm that your word is supernaturally interlinked together like Levi. It's just awesome to see, and we are astonished by your wisdom and your greatness, and you are far more removed from us in your wisdom, your knowledge, your superiority, and your power, and we just stand in awe, and we just want to ask you to be with us as we go through these processes. Some of us go through a Job process and different cycles of that. Father, just give us the patience, and through your Spirit, give us spiritual manna, give us support of the body, and help us to sustain us through those wilderness experiences we face. But at the end, we know that we will be mature, we will be elevated, and we will be one with you. And we just want to praise you and thank you for all of that in the mighty name of Yeshua Mashiach. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much. Thank you for being patient with us all, and please give our love to Letty. We miss her very much. We miss you both very much.
Now we miss you too.
But it's lovely that you've got a good life now.
Yeah, no, we try to still influence people, spread life as far as we can. So
Oh,
yeah,
I know you would always do that. That's the beauty of you.
but we're still connected to you
Of course.
until
Look
the end of
what I've
time
learned.
and beyond.
No,
Yeah.
and if you ever come over, please let us know
Yep.
so we can all
definitely.
get together again.
Yep.
So thank you so much, darling. It's I really appreciate your time that you spend for all of us. It's
You're
very
welcome.
greatly loved. Thank you so much, and good night and bye-bye.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
I think
Yeah,
Manna's
thank you, Phil. If you can hear me.
Yes, now I can hear you. It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Manna's words were speaking on behalf of all of us, I reckon, because we really do appreciate all that you do for us, Philip.
No,
Thank you so much.
it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience.
And good night to you, and happy Sabbath.
You too.
Have a wonderful
Yes.
Sabbath. I'm going to have one always.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
I
Bye.
don't know how
Bye,
to
everyone.